Let's start with the time he looked a guest dead in the eye and said, "You can't sit here and pretend you're the victim when you created the chaos." The words carried the weight of every poor decision that had been laid out on the stage. In that moment, the guest could no longer hide behind rehearsed lines or half-through excuses. The truth was too plain to ignore, and the audience felt the tension shift as reality settled in. It wasn't simply a matter of calling someone out for bad behavior. It was about showing that actions have consequences and that sympathy is not automatic when someone has hurt the people around them. This confrontation revealed how easy it is for people to weave narratives that cast them in a flattering light while conveniently erasing the harm they cause. The statement made it clear that the cycle of blame had finally been broken. When he delivered those words, there was no anger in his voice, just a firm resolve to stand up for the truth. That tone, calm but unyielding, left no room for deflection. The guest shifted uncomfortably in the chair, realizing that the usual tactics wouldn't work here. The moment demanded honesty, no matter how much it stung to admit the part they played in the turmoil. The audience leaned in, captivated by the rare clarity that can only come when someone stops pretending. It was as if the entire room held its breath, waiting to see if the guest would finally acknowledge the obvious. For many watching, this was a lesson in personal responsibility, a reminder that growth begins when you own your mistakes instead of hiding from them. Even the guest's body language betrayed the struggle to hold onto the illusion of innocence. Shoulders that had been squared in defiance began to slump under the pressure of truth. Eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that would not come. There was nowhere left to run because the conversation had stripped away every layer of denial. This exchange wasn't about humiliation or spectacle. It was about cutting through the noise to get to the heart of the matter. When someone has spent years justifying the damage they have caused, it can take a moment of stark honesty to finally break through. The words served as a mirror, reflecting the reality the guest had tried so hard to avoid. In the end, that single sentence stood out as one of the most unforgettable moments on the stage. It was a reminder that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is refuse to let someone lie to themselves any longer. The confrontation wasn't about winning an argument, but about offering a chance, however painful, to change course before it was too late. Another unforgettable moment came when he raised his voice, not out of anger, but out of sheer disbelief that someone could justify stealing from their own family. The atmosphere in the studio shifted instantly. What had started as an attempt by the guest to appear, misunderstood, quickly unraveled into something impossible to defend. The audience could sense that this wasn't a performance or a tactic for ratings. It was the raw frustration of someone who had listened to too many excuses for too long. He leaned forward in his chair, eyes fixed on the guest, and methodically recited every instance where trust had been betrayed. Each fact landed like a hammer on the table, making it impossible for the guest to retreat into denial. There was no malice in the way he spoke, only a deep disappointment that someone could look their loved ones in the eye and pretend nothing was wrong. The guest shifted uncomfortably but offered no apology. The questions came rapid fire, each one exposing another contradiction in the guest story. How do you rationalize emptying a parent's savings account? How do you convince yourself that taking money meant for your child's future is somehow acceptable? The more he spoke, the clearer it became that the guest had convinced themselves of a version of events that bore no resemblance to reality. When he finally paused, the room was so quiet you could hear someone in the audience exhale. The guest tried to answer, but every justification sounded hollow against the weight of the evidence. He didn't have to shout to make his point. The raised voice was just a way to shake the guest out of the comfortable lies they had been telling for years. It was a voice that said enough was enough. Even in that intensity, there was an undercurrent of hope. He wasn't tearing the guest down just to shame them. He wanted them to see that no healing could happen while they continued to dodge the truth. It was an invitation to stop running and start owning the pain they had caused. That's why the words resonated so powerfully. They were a demand for accountability and an offer of redemption at the same time. As the guest finally lowered their eyes to the floor, it was clear that the message had landed. For perhaps the first time, they were confronted with the impact of their actions laid out plainly for everyone to see. There was no laughter, no applause, only the quiet realization that this was a crossroads moment. It was the point where excuses end and change begins. This exchange stood out among so many others because it captured exactly why these conversations matter. They strip away the layers of justification and force people to confront who they really are. In that uncomfortable silence, something genuine can finally grow. The understanding that facing the truth, however painful, is the only way forward. One of the most viral instances was when he leaned forward, voice tight, and told a young guest, "You are not special because you're rude. You're just rude." The words were delivered with a calm certainty that made them impossible to dismiss. For a few seconds, no one in the room moved or spoke. It was as if the entire audience needed time to process the blunt truth that had just been laid bare in front of them. The guest had spent the earlier part of the conversation wearing an almost smug expression, convinced that their outrageous behavior was some badge of honor. They recounted stories of disrespect and entitlement as if these things were achievements to be proud of. But the moment those words were spoken, you could see the confidence begin to slip. The guest looked genuinely stunned that someone would call them out so directly without flinching or sugarcoating the reality. It wasn't said with cruelty or to embarrass the guest in front of the cameras. It was said because sometimes the most compassionate response is absolute honesty. There was no applause line, no theatrical flourish, just a simple statement of fact. The power in those few words came from their clarity. They cut through the posturing and self-importance like a sharp blade. The audience didn't need to be told what had just happened. They felt it. You could sense an unspoken agreement among the people watching that this was a moment of truth. It was an example of how easily arrogance collapses when faced with someone unwilling to validate it. For the guest, it was a lesson that being loud and disrespectful does not make you interesting or important. It only isolates you from those who might have cared. When he leaned back in his chair, the guest tried to recover their composure, but it was obvious the mask had slipped. For perhaps the first time, they seemed unsure of how to respond. No quick comeback or practiced smirk could undo the fact that someone had finally refused to play along with the charade. In that silence, the reality settled in that rudeness is not a personality, it's a choice, and often a deeply unattractive one. That exchange became so widely shared because it resonated far beyond the studio. People saw themselves or someone they knew in that moment. They recognized how often bad behavior is excused under the guise of confidence or independence. But here it was called out plainly, leaving no place to hide. The moment was memorable not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. It served as a reminder that respect is never owed to arrogance, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop letting them pretend their worst qualities make them special. In another heated exchange, he stopped mid-sentence, took off his glasses, and asked, "Are you hearing yourself right now?" The question didn't come out as an insult or a cheap jab. It was delivered in a tone that sounded almost weary, as though he had finally reached the limit of what he was willing to tolerate. The effect was immediate. The guest blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the unexpected challenge to their endless string of excuses. For a moment the entire room seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't the volume of his words that made them powerful, but the absolute disbelief in his voice. He was genuinely stunned that someone could sit there in front of their family and say such things with a straight face. The guest's elaborate justifications had gone from questionable to absurd, and that simple question made it impossible to pretend otherwise. He didn't have to explain why he asked it. Everyone understood that it was the kind of question that comes when patience finally runs out. It was as if he was giving the guest one last opportunity to step back and hear how hollow their own words had become. There was no anger in that moment, only clarity. It was the sound of someone holding up a mirror and refusing to look away from what it reflected. The guest tried to recover, fumbling for a response that might restore their sense of control over the conversation, but it was already too late. The question had pierced every rehearsed answer and every carefully crafted narrative. There was no quick fix or clever remark that could undo the impact of being forced to listen to their own voice, stripped of all pretense. He placed his glasses carefully on the table, still watching the guest with the same steady gaze. The silence stretched out between them, growing heavier with each passing second. It was the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled, because it already says everything. The audience could see that this was no longer just an interview. It was a reckoning. For many people watching, that moment became a lesson in how powerful it can be to simply ask the right question. Sometimes, when people are lost in their own lies, the only way to reach them is to break the rhythm of their story and make them hear it for what it really is. That question did exactly that. It forced the guest to look at themselves honestly, maybe for the first time in a long time. When he finally picked up his glasses again and settled back into his chair, the conversation continued, but it was never the same. The tone had shifted permanently. From that point on, there was no escaping the reality that had been exposed. It was one of those rare moments when a single sentence changes everything. Who could forget the time he had to walk across the stage to calm himself because the guest was so deep in denial he could hardly sit still? It was one of those moments when you could see the tension building long before it finally broke through. The guest sat there, arms crossed and jaw set, determined to reject every fact laid in front of them. No matter how gently the truth was offered, they pushed it away as if acknowledging even a fraction of it would shatter their entire sense of self. He began the conversation in the same measured, reasonable tone he always used. He offered evidence, asked questions, and gave the guest every chance to reconsider. But with each denial, the frustration in his eyes became harder to hide. You could see he was trying to stay calm, trying not to let exasperation get the better of him. Still, there comes a point when patience alone won't break through a wall of denial. When he finally rose from his chair and walked across the stage, it wasn't about theatrics or making a spectacle. It was about taking a breath, collecting his thoughts, and refusing to let the conversation spiral into a pointless argument. The audience watched in total silence as he paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back. Everyone knew this wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the deliberate act of someone who cared enough not to give up, even when it would have been easier to end the discussion. The guest stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact, convinced that if they just held their ground long enough, the truth would somehow go away. But the act of stepping away only made it clearer how determined he was to reach them. He wasn't walking off in defeat. He was showing that sometimes you have to pause before you can keep trying to help someone see what they don't want to see. When he returned to his seat, he looked calmer, but there was a different energy in his voice. It was firmer, more resolute, and unmistakably serious. He explained again that denial doesn't erase reality, that refusing to acknowledge harm doesn't make the harm disappear. The guest shifted in their chair, visibly unsettled by the quiet certainty of his words. No raised voice, no accusations, just the unshakable insistence that the truth was not going to change to make anyone feel better. It was a powerful lesson for everyone watching. Sometimes, no matter how patient or compassionate you are, you can't force someone to be honest with themselves. All you can do is stand your ground and refuse to join them in their denial. That moment on the stage was a reminder that integrity means telling the truth, even when it costs you comfort or approval. The conversation continued, but the mood had changed. There was no more pretending that denial was a valid option. He had shown by his own example that stepping back doesn't mean stepping down. It means gathering the strength to keep telling the truth, no matter how many times someone tries to look away. Another highlight was when he challenged a guest bragging about scamming strangers online. The guest spoke with a kind of swagger, as if defrauding innocent people was something to admire. They described their schemes in vivid detail, smiling proudly as if recounting a great personal victory. For a while, the audience listened in stunned silence, trying to make sense of the complete lack of remorse. It was clear the guest thought this behavior made them clever or superior to everyone else. He let the guest finish, not interrupting once, though you could see the disbelief growing on his face. He sat forward in his chair, hands clasped, eyes fixed unblinking on the guest. There was no hint of admiration or amusement in his expression, only a kind of quiet sadness mixed with disappointment. It was obvious he had heard plenty of shocking confessions before, but there was something uniquely unsettling about the pride in the guest's voice. When he finally spoke, his words were calm but carried a weight that seemed to fill the room. "You think this is clever, but it's pathetic." The sentence landed like a stone dropped in still water, rippling through the audience and settling into the guest's smug composure. For the first time since the conversation began, the guest's grin faltered. It was as if they hadn't expected anyone to call out the emptiness of what they were doing so plainly. He didn't raise his voice or resort to insults. He didn't have to. The simplicity of the statement made it more powerful than any lecture. It exposed the truth that no amount of bragging could cover up, that hurting other people for personal gain isn't cunning or impressive. It's just mean, spirited, and small. The audience erupted in applause because they recognized the courage it takes to call something by its true name when so many would rather pretend it was harmless. The guest looked around, as if hoping for someone to come to their defense. But no one did. In that moment, it was undeniable that the behavior being described wasn't something to be admired. It was something to regret. Even the guest's body language began to shift, the bravado draining away as they realized how completely alone they were in their self-justification. He continued, explaining that living by deceit and celebrating it doesn't make a person successful. It only proves how little they respect themselves or others. His voice remained steady, not angry, but resolute. There was no trace of judgment for who the guest was, only disappointment in the choices they had made, and that distinction was what made the words so devastatingly honest. By the end of the conversation, the guest seemed less certain, less proud. The applause had died down, but the message remained unshakable and clear. Scamming people doesn't make you clever, it makes you small, and when someone finally has the courage to say so, it leaves no room to hide behind the illusion of superiority. There was also the time he warned a guest that their reckless behavior could end in tragedy. You could hear the frustration in his voice because he knew he might be the last person trying to get through to them. The conversation began with cautious questions, an attempt to understand how someone could spiral so far into self-destruction without seeing the consequences waiting at the end. But as the guest described their actions with casual indifference, something in his demeanor shifted from curiosity to deep concern. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, searching the guest's face for any glimmer of awareness. It was as if he was trying to find some sign that the message was getting through, but the guest kept deflecting, brushing off every warning with a shrug. It wasn't arrogance so much as denial, a refusal to admit that playing with danger could cost them everything. The more he listened, the clearer it became that the guest was gambling with their own life without understanding the stakes. His voice grew heavier as he began to describe what would happen if this pattern didn't change. There was no drama in his tone, no attempt to shock for the sake of an audience. He simply laid out the facts step by step, explaining how one bad choice could become irreversible. The guest shifted uncomfortably, but still tried to pretend it wasn't serious. That was when he raised his hand slightly and said, "Enough." You could feel the air change in the room. He wasn't angry in that moment. He was pleading with the guest to see reality before it was too late. The frustration in his voice wasn't about ego or control. It was about caring enough to tell someone a truth they didn't want to hear. He described in detail how easily a single moment of recklessness could turn into a tragedy that no one could undo. For the first time the guest looked shaken, their bravado slipping just enough to reveal fear underneath. He seized that moment to drive the point home, reminding them that no one else might be willing to have this conversation again. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "there are no second chances." His voice cracked ever so slightly, not with anger, but with the weight of knowing how many people never came back from the same path. The audience was silent, riveted by the raw honesty of what was unfolding. It wasn't a confrontation so much as an intervention, a final attempt to reach someone standing on the edge of disaster. He didn't sugarcoat any part of it, because he knew that the truth was the only thing that could save the guest from themselves. That refusal to soften the message made it all the more compassionate. As the conversation ended, you could see that something had shifted. The guest's eyes were downcast and their voice was quieter, no longer full of rehearsed explanations. It was clear they had finally glimpsed the danger of their own choices, and though no one could be sure whether the warning would be enough to change the outcome, he had done everything possible to help them see it before it was too late. One remarkable moment came when he cut off a guest mid-rant and declared, "I'm not going to sit here and listen to you blame everyone else for your decisions." The words landed so suddenly that the guest froze, mouth still open, as if the next excuse had been waiting on the tip of their tongue. It wasn't shouted or delivered with any dramatic flourish. It was simply said with an unshakable firmness that made it clear the conversation had reached a turning point. The guest had spent most of the discussion rattling off a list of grievances against nearly everyone in their life. Each sentence began with someone else's name, as if the only thing that kept them from being happy was the endless failures of everyone around them. For a while he listened patiently, trying to separate genuine hurt from the habit of blame. But as the rant spiraled on, it became obvious that no amount of empathy would make the guest take responsibility for anything. When he finally interrupted, there was no anger in his voice. It sounded more like disappointment, a quiet refusal to indulge a story that had been repeated too many times. His words were so plain and direct that it took the guest a moment to realize what had happened. This wasn't just another conversation where they could vent without consequence. It was a moment where someone finally said enough. The audience seemed to exhale all at once. Everyone watching could feel how often this guest had used blame to deflect from their own choices. There was a collective recognition that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to stop pretending those excuses hold any weight. In that second, the dynamic shifted. The guest wasn't in control anymore, and it showed in the way they sat back, eyes darting as they tried to come up with a response. He didn't fill the silence that followed. Instead, he let it hang there, giving the guest a chance to feel the emptiness of their narrative without anyone nodding along. It wasn't cruel. It was an invitation to finally step into honesty. The guest's shoulders slumped as the realization set in that there would be no more validation for their complaints. From here on, the conversation would be about what they had done, not what everyone else had failed to do. After a long pause, he calmly explained that growth can't happen until you own your part in the mess. He said that blaming others might feel safer in the moment, but it ultimately keeps you stuck exactly where you are. His voice was steady, free of judgment, but also free of any willingness to play along. In that moment, he showed that compassion and accountability are not opposites. Sometimes they are the same thing. By the end of the exchange, something had changed. The guest no longer seemed eager to speak. They looked down, quietly absorbing the fact that the script they'd relied on for so long had finally stopped working. And in that uncomfortable silence, you could see the first flicker of real self-reflection, the tiny beginning of something more honest than blame. One remarkable moment came when he cut off a guest mid-rant and declared, "I'm not going to sit here and listen to you blame everyone else for your decisions." The words came out so calmly and so decisively that the entire room fell silent. For a moment the guest simply stared back, stunned, as if no one had ever interrupted their litany of complaints before. You could almost see the calculations happening in their mind, searching for a way to recover control over the conversation. But there was no way to keep going as if nothing had changed. The guest had been talking non-stop, weaving an elaborate narrative about how every failure, every setback, and every disappointment was someone else's fault. Each sentence was another attempt to avoid any responsibility. He listened for a long time without interrupting, giving the guest the space to be heard, but there comes a point when listening becomes enabling, and he wasn't willing to cross that line. When he finally spoke up, it wasn't to scold or humiliate. It was simply to draw a clear boundary. He made it known that no progress could happen as long as the guest continued to see themselves as a perpetual victim. His voice stayed low and even, but the firmness in his tone left no room for argument. It was an unmistakable sign that the conversation had shifted from sympathetic listening to necessary confrontation. The guest tried to continue, stammering through half-finished sentences that trailed off as it became obvious no one was buying into the story anymore. The power of that moment wasn't in the volume of his words, but in the certainty behind them. He wasn't asking permission to challenge the narrative. He was simply stating that it ended right then and there. The impact was immediate, and the guest began to realize their usual tactics wouldn't work. In the long pause that followed, you could feel the discomfort settling over the studio. The audience shifted in their seats, aware they were witnessing something rare. A person being forced to sit with the truth instead of burying it beneath excuses. He didn't rush to fill the silence or soften the impact. He just waited, letting the moment do its work. Eventually, he explained in a quiet voice that blaming other people doesn't absolve you of the consequences of your own decisions. It only guarantees that you stay stuck in the same destructive patterns. He reminded the guest that growth requires the courage to look honestly at your own role in your problems. It was a message delivered without anger, but also without compromise. By the time the conversation moved forward, the guest seemed different, quieter, less certain, and finally willing to listen. That moment was powerful because it showed that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is refuse to keep pretending. It was a reminder that telling someone the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, is an act of respect and, ultimately, of hope. Finally, perhaps the most iconic instance was when he stood up, stared down at the guest, and said, "This is not entertainment. This is your life unraveling in real time." The words carried a finality that settled over the entire room like a heavy blanket. There was no applause, no gasp from the audience, just a profound silence as everyone absorbed the seriousness of what had just been said. It wasn't a line meant to create a viral clip. It was a simple, undeniable truth that no one could look away from. The guest had been treating the conversation as if it were nothing more than a performance. Every answer sounded rehearsed, every reaction calculated to provoke a reaction. There was a smugness in their expression that suggested they believed they were in control of the narrative. But as soon as those words were spoken, all the bravado drained away, leaving only the reality they had worked so hard to avoid confronting. He didn't sit back down right away. He stood there, looking at the guest with an expression that was equal parts sadness and resolve. His posture alone communicated that this was the end of pretending. The show, in that moment, stopped feeling like a spectacle and became what it had always intended to be, an intervention, a chance for someone to see the damage they were doing before it was too late to change. The guest tried to smile, to deflect with a sarcastic remark, but even their own voice seemed unsure. It was clear that no amount of performance could disguise the fact that their life was falling apart in front of everyone's eyes. The mask had slipped, and there was nothing left to hide behind. It was a moment that laid bare the cost of denial and the loneliness that comes from refusing to be honest. He continued speaking, explaining that the cameras and the audience didn't make the problems any less real. If anything, the visibility only made it harder to run from them. His voice was steady and low, never rising above what was necessary. It was as if he wanted to strip away every last distraction so the guest could finally see what they had become. The audience didn't need to be told how significant the moment was. You could see it on their faces, the recognition that this was no longer just an episode to watch and then forget. It was a reminder of how quickly a person's life can slide into chaos when they care more about appearances than truth. That recognition was sobering, a quiet warning to anyone who thought the same thing couldn't happen to them. When he finally sat down again, he did so slowly, almost as if to mark that the conversation had reached a point of no return. The guests looked down at their hands, their shoulders slumped, and for the first time they seemed to understand the seriousness of their situation. It was a moment that made it clear that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is tell someone the truth so plainly they can't help but hear it.